Hey everybody, this is Dan, and this is another chapter of Dr. Dan's little corner of knowledge, another desktop lecture. And this is for week 14, so we're winding down rapidly here. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video from last week about Robert Noyce. You probably learned a lot of things you didn't know before, and certainly you could make the argument now that he's one of the most important inventors and also businessmen in the history of the U.S. So, when we think about the history of business in the United States, the regular folks out there who haven't been through this class, they think about Edison, they think about Ford, kind of the same old stuff. But now you can pull Noyce out of your tool bag and let people know that really the most important inventions, the inventions that have impacted the most people, and I would argue for the better, really came from someone no one knows about, Robert Noyce and the integrated circuit. So not only that innovation of the integrated circuit, but also the way he changed business, so businesses are more open, are less hierarchical, and that's a cool thing about Noyce. And also the way that this whole notion of Silicon Valley and an industry into itself, and an industry that changed America's economy, came about because of Noyce and Andy Grove and Moore and some of the other folks that were in that video. So that's cool. That's something we know about, and we'll cover that more on the final exam. At the end of the Noyce video, you remember he was talking to one of my heroes, Steve Jobs. And I'm not really sure why Jobs is one of my heroes, because one of the reasons I don't have much money is because of Steve Jobs, because, I'm always the one to get the latest iPhone, or, my MacBook Pro, or the iMac that I'm using right now to record this video. And I know many of you have drank the Apple Kool-Aid as well, and many of you haven't. But for those of us that are Apple aficionados, the strength of that brand is pretty strong. And so this week we're going to watch a hour-long documentary from PBS on Steve Jobs called One Last Thing. And I think it's a nice tie-in, because if you remember last week, we left Robert Noyce meeting with Steve Jobs, and now we're going to talk about Steve Jobs this week. Many of you probably know the basic story of Apple Computer, certainly know about Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who was at the University of Toledo last year, who I went to see, how they founded the company, and worked in Steve Jobs' garage to build the first Mac, that sort of thing. The video this week, the documentary this week, is more about Steve Jobs, the man, than the company, but it mixes elements of the company in as well. So I think it's a good documentary to get an introduction of who he is. Now, we've talked throughout this class about people that innovate, or people that change the way business works, either through systems or through inventions. And from Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, up through Carnegie and Rockefeller, up to David Sarnoff, Robert Noyce, and now Steve Jobs. And I think what I've tried to do is pick out people who really changed the way either business works or had a big impact on society. And certainly Steve Jobs fits into that category as far as I'm concerned. So, one of the things that Steve Jobs says at the beginning of this documentary, and it's something that I really like. He says something about, you go through life and you're living in a world that other people have created. And he said, for him, when he came to that realization that people that created everything around him, people that ran the government, people that really, created his life, were just people who were no smarter than he was. And once he figured that out, he really, took on this persona of someone who wasn't afraid to, color outside the box, if you will, and try new things. And so he had that bravado about him, where he wasn't afraid to put forward new ideas and push them, and it resulted in some great innovations. Now, that having been said, he wasn't really as kind of a personality as Robert Noyce. He was more dictatorial, very similar to Henry Ford and very similar to Thomas Edison. He wasn't always a good guy to work for, and I think that comes out throughout this documentary. and so, you know, some of you already know that. Some of you will learn that as you go through the film. The other thing I want you to get out of the film, and we'll talk about it in the discussion board. At one point in this video, they talk about the hippie versus the nerd role in Apple Computer. I want you to think about that for the discussion board this week, this idea of hippie versus nerd. And I think, you know, that could be translated in many different ways. The dreamer versus the business person. But I think that, you know, successful businesses in this country, if we go backward in history, either have one person that was both a hippie and a nerd, you know, had the left and the right brain thing going, or was a combination of two people, like in the case of the beginnings of Apple Computer, that brought those two aspects of business together. To be an innovator, you have to be a little bit of a dreamer. You have to be a little bit of that hippie role. But to make the company work and make it successful as far as business fundamentals go, you know, there needs to be the nerd aspect of doing things right, of doing things efficient, and making sure that the innovations are doable, making sure you can engineer these innovations. So I think that's another important part of the documentary that I really like. The other thing I want you to know, or I want you to be able to discuss, we might even have this in the final exam, it's sort of a fun question, is how did a butter dish and a bottle of deodorant come together to invent the computer mouse? Again, you talk about thinking outside of the box. That's one of the coolest parts of this documentary, and it only lasts about 2 minutes, that particular section. But I want you to think about how a butter dish and a bottle of deodorant come together to invent a computer mouse that some of you still use today. Most of you use a trackpad, but I think most of you know what a mouse is. So think about that. That's pretty cool. What that shows is that sometimes, you know, we have to look way outside the box and sort of daydream to think about how to put things together for innovation, and not only systems but also devices as well. So give that some thought as you go through. And then the other thing is that you'll pick up in this documentary is, you know, who came to Steve Jobs. In other words, when we watched the Noyce film, we saw Steve Jobs coming to Robert Noyce to learn things. In the Jobs video, they mentioned, just very briefly, you may miss it, about people that came to Steve Jobs to learn. And so they'll reference the, you know, Sergey Brin, you know, briefly, the people from Google they'll talk about, and that came to Steve Jobs. So you can see this chain of innovation, these revered figures out in Silicon Valley that come together to really invent much of the world that we live in today. Now, you know, hopefully this is a lot more fun than studying, you know, dead white presidents or that sort of thing. You know, what I want you to do is think about how you can apply some of the innovation and some of the techniques and some of the philosophies from Steve Jobs into your own lives, and think about, you know, how that can help you in your careers, and also how it stacks up in sort of this timeline of American business that we've been covering. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoy the video. Please watch everything all the way through. Again, just like last week, we don't have a reading for this week, so you can sit back and watch the YouTube video, maybe on your iPhone or on your Mac, and think about you know, the innovator that put these systems together and went to market with them. And you know, also, God, the iPod, the iPad, so many things that we learn in this documentary. So I hope you enjoy it. Everyone's doing a great job. I may not talk to you before the holidays, so be safe. Don't eat too much, and enjoy your family. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye-bye.